So let's look at where the heart is located. It's in the thoracic cavity. It actually runs along the mediastinum of the thoracic cavity between the lungs, and it's protected by our sternum and our rib cage. The base of the heart is actually at kind of the top. It's like on the superior region. And then the apex is this little tiny pointy region that's pointing to the left side of the body. And here's just a larger picture showing the same structure, but it's labeled as well, okay? So the heart is enclosed by a fibrous pericardial sac. So it has a connective tissue, dense regular connective tissue surrounding the heart. And then deeper to that connective tissue, you have a serous membrane. The serous membrane functions, if you remember from chapter 1, and then we talked again about it in chapter 5, I believe. The serous membrane of the heart is known as the visceral and parietal pericardium. The visceral covers the organ, and the parietal covers the cavity, PC. So PC, cavity, BO organ. Here you can see everything. Here's that fibrous pericardium that helps in holding the heart where it belongs. And then right here along this edge, there's the parietal pericardium. And then right along this edge is the visceral pericardium. The visceral pericardium is also known as your epicardium. So there are layers to the heart. The epicardium is the outermost layer of the heart. These grooves here are known as sulci, and the sulci contain coronary vessels, so blood vessels that feed the heart or that drain the deoxygenated blood back into the right atrium. There are different coronary sulci in different areas. So here you can see the posterior atrioventricular sulcus. Here's another a view of the atrioventricular sulcus. The thickness of the heart walls differs in the ventricles greatly, and the reason for this, so look at how thin the right ventricle thickness is and how thick the left ventricle is. Think about where the blood is moving from the right side of the heart. Where does it go to? And if you said the lungs, you are correct. It's going right to the lungs, which is still in that thoracic cavity. It doesn't have a real long route to move. But if you're looking at the left ventricle is pumping blood from the thoracic cavity to the brain, all the way down to your toes, to your fingers, so all over. And because of this, it has to have more power because it has to pump blood farther away. The layers of the heart, I mentioned this already once, but the outermost layer is known as the epicardium. It's also the visceral serous membrane. It's composed of a single layer of simple squamous epithelium underlying a thin layer of connective tissue known as areolar connective tissue. The myocardium is the thickest region of the heart, and you can see the myocardium here. Here's myocardium. See the myocardium there. It's much thicker on the left side than the right side, which I already mentioned. Myocardium is heart muscle. It's the only region of the body that has heart muscle or cardiac muscle. And then the endocardium is the inner region that lines the atria and the ventricles. And the endocardium is also composed of a single layer of epithelium cells, simple squamous epithelium, with an underlying areolar connective tissue. There is an interatrial septum and an interventricular septum. These separate the chambers, the right and left atria and the right and left ventricles. This keeps blood from mixing. So the right side is deoxygenated, Left side is oxygen rich. If we have mixing of the blood, then we're going to get oxygen poor and rich blood going to the body system as well as to the lungs, and it's going to be a lot of energy wasted. There's a special structure right here in the heart called the fossa ovalis. It's a depression in the heart. Fossa is just a depression, and it's an area that during fetal development was a hole. It was called the foramen ovale, and the function of that hole was to shunt blood from the right atrium to the left atrium, because in the fetus there is no oxygen coming in from the lungs via breathing. They're in a tiny little sac in the uterus. They don't have, their lungs aren't even functioning. Their lungs are one of the last organs to start functioning. And because of this, they have to get their nutrients from something else. And they get their nutrients from mom. So mom's blood gives them oxygen. And so oxygen rich blood moves in from the umbilical vein, and then by the time it gets to the right atrium, it's mixed blood, but it still has oxygen rich. There's no point in sending blood down and out through pulmonary circulation because you're not going to get any nutrients from the lungs. So it goes right through to the left atrium, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well as in lab. These little strings here, these are called your chordae tendineae. They're the strings, the heartstrings that people talk about when you're pulling on heartstrings. Well, these are your heartstrings. They're chordae tendineae, and they're held in place by these structures, these little muscles called papillary muscles. These papillary muscles are smooth muscles anchored, that anchor the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve in place. And so they help to control the tricuspid and bicuspid valve. The valves then ensure a one-way flow of blood. So blood goes from the atria to the ventricles, from the ventricles out to either pulmonary or systemic circulation. Atrioventricular valves control blood moving from the atrium to the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, the AV valves close, because when the ventricles contract, they push pressure up and the AV valves close up. Then when the ventricles relax, the AV valves will eventually open back up again and blood can pool down. The chordae tendineae help to maintain the valves so that the valves don't invert and open up to the atrium. They hold them in place so they stay closed and don't just push up. Make sense? So here you have the atrioventricular valve opened, blood can flow down. Here's the atrioventricular valve closed, and it's being held in place by those chordae tendineae. The semilunar valves then are what control movement of blood from the ventricles out into the blood vessels. And they open and close in response to changes in pressure. So when the ventricles have a higher pressure than the arteries, the blood vessels that the blood's going to move out into, the semilunar valves will open and blood will push out into the arteries. But if semilunar valve, or if there's more pressure in the arteries than in the ventricles or the semilunar valves will stay closed. And this is kind of what I've just talked about. When blood moves out, it's pushed rapidly out of the ventricles. Then the pressure in the ventricles becomes lower than the pressure in the arteries. And that causes blood to start moving back towards the ventricles. The movement of blood towards the ventricles actually causes the semilunar valves to close back up. It's like blood is rushing, and it closes the semilunar valve. The semilunar valve closes, and blood can't go into the ventricles, so it moves back out to the system or to the pulmonary circulation. And so here we have increased pressure in the ventricles causes the semilunar valves to open, and blood moves out. As the pressure changes, so the ventricles have lower pressure, blood starts to flow back down, but that causes the semilunar valves to close, and so blood then is going to move back out. So I mentioned the sulci, where we have coronary vessels that feed the heart. The heart itself has tons of blood moving through it every second of every day. But that blood that's moving through it isn't feeding it. So as blood moves out of the aorta, the first branch off the aorta is actually the coronary arteries. And we have two coronary arteries, a right and left coronary artery, that branch off and transport blood to the heart muscle. So here we have a branch of the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. Once they branch out, they bring blood. The right coronary artery branches off into a marginal artery, which you see right here. And then you can see here, it's red. This is branching into a posterior interventricular artery. You can see it running here. It's light color because it's actually, it's on the back side. So it's really just showing where it would be if we were flipping the heart over. Okay. And then here we have the left coronary artery that branches off into a circumflex artery, this one right here, and then this is the anterior interventricular artery. Actually, this artery is really important. If a blood clot occurs right in this area, so a blood clot, or you have buildup of cholesterol or anything in this area, it leads to what we call a widowmaker heart attack. And, well, it's called a widowmaker for a reason. It makes widows. So this is a really important artery that needs to stay clean and healthy. I talk about it because my husband actually had a widowmaker heart attack, so it was a very scary time in our life, and he lived. So, yay, right? But not everyone lives from this. We got lucky, and now he has a stent right here that he goes to a doctor every 6 months to be checked out again. So here are the different blood vessels. This is the labeled picture showing coronary circulation and how blood moves out and feeds the heart. All of the blood comes back to the heart through coronary veins, cardiac veins, I should say, and they all drain into the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus then drains directly into the right atrium. So you can see that little hole there. We have a hole for the superior and inferior vena cava, and we also have this hole right here for the coronary sinus. And here are the different cardiac veins that drain into the coronary sinus. So some disorders associated with the heart. We have atherosclerosis, which is it's known as hardening of the arteries, usually associated with plaque buildup. So this could be cholesterol and fatty tissues building up, causing the artery to harden, and blood flow slows down. This can lead to a coronary spasm, where the blood vessel actually starts to contract, and that leads to pain associated with the heart, known as angina. Angina actually is one of the first signs of a severe heart attack. And so here you can see the occluded artery, and you can see the spasm of the artery. And this can lead to the angina pectoris, which is a severe pain associated with the chest, left side of the arm, jaw, associated with a heart attack. I'm going to stop right here.